enlightened leadership, mainly in the Senate, from this state, and how to move toward cap and trade without the negative consequences of extreme cost to industry and the country. So I'll conclude right there.
Hi, my name is Nick Hodson. I'm a principal with McKinsey & Company in San Francisco. I'm actually I'm British origin, and I must say I was quite taken this morning with the national anthem and everything, because I actually became a citizen just a few weeks ago. So that was my first time for something like that. Just a word about my firm and our kind of position in this whole debate. Firstly, McKinsey & Company is a management consulting firm. We advise senior management of very large companies, mostly on a whole range of business issues. We are not, by implication, we are not a firm of environmental scientists. Neither are we a firm of lobbyists. In fact, officially, if you like, McKinsey has absolutely no position on whether or not global warming is happening. Now, individually, we can read it, and I personally believe it is. But we're not kind of here to grind an axe about global warming or any particular solution. What we're more about is, given the way the wind is blowing in the kind of business world, you need to, if you're in business, you need to get on this train and figure out what it means for you. As previous speaker said, the Obama administration, I mean, you could see this a couple of years ago, right? But the Obama administration is clearly on this topic in a big way. There is going to be some form of legislation. Only in some sense, it's just required to figure out the details. And so, where I work with my clients is, so what are we going to do about it? Or how could we position for advantage in this new world? Are there costs we need to think about? Are there new ways of configuring our supply chain in a carbon-constrained world? Things like that. And it's surprising, in fact, how much there is. We're talking a lot about leaning out the energy use in companies, and it's surprising how much juice, if you like, there is in that. Despite the fact that there have been engineers sort of considering this for years and years and years, there's still lots and lots and lots of really pretty low-hanging fruit to reduce energy usage, and of course, by implication, carbon. Can I have the slides? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tick through a brief introduction to carbon abatement. Many of you have probably read the McKinsey report on the U.S. Greenhouse gas abatement opportunities, and that's on our website and is a good read if you've got the time. Then we'll talk a little bit about how a carbon market works. In particular, we'll look at the European Emissions Trading Scheme, the EU ETS. We'll have a quick look at some of the proposed legislation, the Waxman bill in the U.S., and how that, just sort of how the U.S. legislature is sort of picking up that question right now. And then, almost for a little bit of kind of light relief at the end, we'll talk a little bit about, as Dan mentioned it, the dairy industry. I happen to have worked in California. I live in California, and I've worked, or at least had plenty of discussions with the California dairy industry about this issue, and we'll just sort of have a look at that and how that might play out. So, firstly, what do we mean by carbon abatement? The first thing you need to understand is that carbon emissions grow essentially with population and economic activity. So the top line, I'll try and explain the charts because I know the graphics are a little bit fuzzy up there, but the top line is the business as usual, the BAU as it's known in the vernacular, the business as usual forecast for global emissions of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's CO2, but also methane and the fluorocarbons and all the rest of it. The lower line is kind of, where the scientists, if you like, say that we need to kind of get to. And so abatement is about trying to fill that wedge. And any activity that reduces sort of aggregate emissions is abatement. That could be, new technologies. It could be more efficient vehicles. It could be energy efficiency in your home. Anything that reduces carbon emissions kind of counts. In the U.S. today, or roughly today anyway, 2005, our emissions were 7.2 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Based on the EIA, that's forecast to rise to 9.7 gigatons by 2030. And we call that kind of the reference case, or the BAU. We use those terms a little bit interchangeably. And if you look at the legislation that's kind of drifting around, nothing's sort of formalized yet or finalized. We need to find a reduction somewhere in the region of 3.5 to 5.5 gigatons by 2030 to meet that legislation, which is a pretty substantial reduction. This is kind of A, the money slide, and B, the eye chart to end all eye charts. Go to the website and you can peruse it at your leisure. This is what we call the 2030 U.S. abatement curve. So let me just try and explain at least the shape of it. If you I'm sure none of you can read the type. I barely can. But on the vertical axis, what you have is the cost per ton of carbon dioxide abated. So anything below the line, you actually made money. It was a positive investment. Without any carbon tax, without any cap and trade, it would make money to carry out that abatement activity. Things above the line cost money. This is based on if you're basically investing at a 7% discount rate. Things below the line earn a return better than 7%. Things above the line earn a return less than 7% in the absence of any carbon tax. So they cost you money. The width is the aggregate abatement. This curve is what we call our medium case. It's a sort of middle of the range version. It's about 3 to 3.5 gigatons wide. So it's just about as much as that sort of low end of the two of the bills that are kind of circulating in Congress. Roughly speaking, you can think of the left-hand end is almost entirely energy efficiency of various kinds. Okay, so literally the most left-hand slice, which is fully $90 per ton of carbon dioxide below the line. So every ton of carbon dioxide you save actually earns you $90 in net present value. That is basically it's electronics in commercial applications. So it's basically computers sitting on standby in offices all the time, stuff like that. As you move across from the right, compact fluorescent light bulbs, and I'm glad to say we do have them. Compact fluorescent light bulbs are one of the next slices over. That it's just if anybody hasn't yet done this math, do this math, get your calculator out, go to Walmart, buy a bulb, and figure it out. And what you will immediately decide is take all your old bulbs out now and replace them with CFLs. It's not a question of don't wait for them to run out. Don't wait for the incandescent to burn out. Replace them now. It's economically attractive right now. It's enormously economically attractive in California, where I pay a whopping 39 cents for my electricity. But I've replaced absolutely everything in my house now. Then as you move further to the right, you get into, there's quite a chunk there, kind of at the sort of knee, I guess you could call it, but still below the line. That's a lot of stuff about vehicles, a lot of fuel efficiency measures in vehicles. Then the piece in the middle, a lot of the things in the middle that are roughly break even. A lot of those things are what you could roughly describe as offsets. It's things like afforestation and stuff like that, and agricultural practices and stuff. And then to the right-hand side, as you start to ramp up there, that's where sort of technology really starts to kick in. So that's where some of the early ones are wind and solar. And as you move on out, carbon capture and sequestration is kind of quite a long way to the right there at the $50, $60 a ton kind of number. The analytics involved are pretty complicated. The message is pretty simple, though, is there's an awful lot of stuff on the left-hand side that's about efficiency. And one of the things that I think we should not lose sight of is going after that stuff on the left-hand side. And it's not necessarily clear that cap and trade schemes and stuff like that have an enormous effect on that. They sort of shift the economics a little bit further in favor. So if cap and trade scheme caused the price of electricity to rise by a little bit, then the economics of changing your light bulb would improve a little bit. But lots of us haven't done it already, and it's already in the money. And so there's a kind of debate, if you like, about to what extent cap and trade really helps the left-hand side. It does help the right-hand side enormously. And as we'll describe, the tighter you turn the screw, the higher the price of carbon will be, and the more of the stuff further out to the right come into the money. So let's just talk a little bit about how a cap and trade scheme, how a carbon scheme might work. In principle, what we're talking about is investment decisions that businesses have to make. And they can make that investment decision, if you like, in the conventional technology. It could be a boiler technology in an oil refinery or something like that. And they invest in that, and they obviously get a stream of savings from that investment or a stream of income from that investment, and they do their NPVs, and they say, okay, good deal, I will make that investment. If there are technologies, however, that without a carbon price are not in the money, then what a cap and trade scheme does is enables you to monetize the carbon savings. So you might invest a little bit of extra, that's the darker blue on the downward bar here. You invest a bit extra, but instead of just sort of, that's just, money that makes you feel good, you can now actually monetize the carbon savings because every year you'll actually have slightly lower emissions and you'll be able to sell that credit for some value. And so the objective of a cap and trade scheme is to put a price on carbon and thus bring technologies into the money that aren't in the money today and enable you to monetize those savings in a way that you can't now. In Europe, I think we have what is the largest and most developed cap and trade scheme in the world. Basically, the way it works is that businesses in Europe with I think the level is 25 megawatts of generating capacity and above. So anyone who's got a power plant of 25 megawatts or above, and that's a pretty small power plant, right? And indeed a whole bunch of big point source emitters, so oil refineries, cement plants, pulp and paper plants, things like that, big point source emitters, have been given an allowance of emission credits. So they have permission to emit so many thousand tons of carbon dioxide a year. The trick is, though, that amount that they can emit in aggregate is declining a little bit each year. And so what that means is that whilst you might have been able to emit 1,000 tons or 1,000,000 tons last year, next year it's going to be a little bit less. And so you must, so you face a choice. You either have to invest in energy efficient technologies or whatever to reduce your emissions, because presumably you could alternatively just reduce your output of your company, right? You could just reduce your output, but presumably you don't want to do that. So you invest to reduce your emissions in a more efficient technology, as I say in a refinery, a boiler upgrade. That reduces your emissions, and so you're now still within your cap. If, however, you reduce them faster than that, so you actually reduce your emissions so much that you're below your level, you now have a surplus of emissions credits that you can sell to someone else. And the way it works is that market will kind of equilibrate, and the people who have easy to achieve emissions savings, i.e. a lot of that is energy efficiency type things, will make those investments because they can very easily sell the credits to somebody else who has much harder emission targets to meet because of the particular setup of their plant or the technology they're using or whatever. In Europe, the way it works is that it's international, and so you can, a power plant in the UK can trade credits with an oil refinery in Spain. In principle, the larger the agglomeration, if you like, the larger the scope of the scheme, the better, because it gives more and more and more scope for efficiency. The whole point of it is that a cap and trade scheme lets the market figure out what the most efficient opportunities to reduce emissions are. It doesn't pick winners in terms of technologies. The technologies compete against each other on their merits. Entrepreneurs can take risks with new technologies if they believe in them, and that kind of thing. And it's an efficient way to reduce emissions. Covered within the ETS, just a little bit of detail. As I say, generation exceeding 20 megawatts. Sorry, oil refineries, coke ovens, ferrous metals, cement, glass, pulp and paper, and in fact they added aviation. I think aviation is going to be in it in a year or so, which is a tricky one for the airlines. They're absolutely hopping mad about it, and they were particularly hopping mad when jet fuel was $160 a barrel last summer. But it basically will add, at $30 a ton, it would add for carbon dioxide, it would add something like 20 or 30 cents to the price of a gallon of jet fuel, and they'll have to pay that. Well, ultimately, we'll pay it. But they have very little alternative, so they're kind of pretty annoyed about that. In 2013, some other sectors will come in: petrochemicals, ammonia, aluminum, and some other gases as well. They'll start introducing some of the PSCs and N2O and stuff like that. So the scheme is increasing in scope. Currently, it covers about 50% of emissions, but that's kind of on an upward track. The other thing, The other thing you can do is what's called a CDM, or a Clean Development Mechanism. This is a sort of particular kind of offset. So if you are struggling to meet your emission cap in I don't know, Tyneside in northeast England at your chemical plant, but you happen to know of a chemical plant in China that is much, much less efficient than you, and you know all about chemical plants, you can go to China and help that chemical plant reduce its emissions, upgrade its boiler, whatever, right? That credit can be then kind of imported from China or imported into Europe as a credit. Now, there is a limit on how much you can do that, but actually that's created quite a flurry of activity, let's say, in CDMs, particularly out of China. About 40% of all the CDMs being traded in Europe are actually exports from China. And it's also created a few funny, weird incentives, like you can actually build a factory in China in order to get the CDM on it, which is not really how it was intended. And that, there's some kinks still being worked out, but it's a fairly powerful concept if correctly implemented. The price of carbon, and this is kind of, this is where the economists get really excited, or the sort of geeks like me. The price of carbon is highly volatile. The first thing that happened, the thing was that the scheme was launched in early 2005. The price rapidly rose, wobbled around a little bit in the sort of 20, 25, 30 euros per ton number. The interesting thing about it was that when they implemented this thing, they basically, this is a little bit unfair probably, but they basically took a bit of a swag at what their total emissions were, right? And so they said the total number of emissions allowances out there is, whatever, however million tons it was. And then off everybody went trading and looking at their opportunities to reduce emissions and all the rest of it. But in sort of mid-2006, a sort of audit was done that actually added up what were the emissions of all the plants, of all the facilities covered by the EU ETS. And they found that it was quite a bit lower than what they thought it was. And so what happened was effectively everyone suddenly realized that the amount of emissions credits available were actually easily as much as the total amount of emissions. And so, Europe suddenly realized it was long credits, right? There were more than they really needed. And so what you see there in mid-2006 was a collapse in the first phase of the prices that came crashing down and effectively, effectively close to zero for some time, and they've now actually expired, those ones. The second phase continues and has wobbled around in this sort of 20, 30 euro area. But what interestingly you can see, and this is the point about economic growth, right? As you go into recession, what's happened is, all these various industrial plants, the cement plant would be a good example, right? No construction happening now. So the cement plant's emissions are going down purely because it's just taking down production because there's no demand for cement. As a result, much less emissions. As a result, you start to feel that you're probably going to be okay on your emissions allowances this year. And so the price of emissions allowances has fallen quite sharply in the last few months, just like the price of everything else. I'll just kind of skip over this, but there's lots of detail in how you design it. Which industry sectors do you cover? What baseline are you using? Do you give away the permits free to emitters? Do you say, here's your allocation? Or do you auction them? There are probably economists in the room who can, debate that into the small hours. Are offsets allowed? Offsets in principle are good, but at the same time, you probably don't want too many, because if you have too much, then it turns out all your emissions reductions happen somewhere else, and they don't happen at home at all. What are the penalties? One of the problems with some of the kind of proto-carbon trading schemes in the US is really that, if I voluntarily sign up, can't I just voluntarily unsign myself, right? And so, they're not particularly credible, if you like, in terms of, if I exceed my emissions, what's actually going to happen to me? Can I bank permits? So if I get ahead, can I bank permits, buy them and keep them, for a couple of years and use them later, or do I have to kind of clear them out at the end of every year? And then, how do I link it with other kinds of emissions trading programs around the world? A quick look at the U.S. legislation. This is the Waxman bill. Actually, pretty aggressive, right? So we're looking at a 42% reduction off the 2005 level by 2030, which is a bold number. That's some way beyond the end of that mid-range curve. It's pretty. The scope is all in the detail. But it's intended to ultimately cover 85% of total emissions. Aggressive. The baseline is a 2005 year. Aggressive targets, as I said. The Waxman bill envisages auctioning, so which is actually a big revenue source for the government. Offsets will be allowed, though they are limited in total scope, though they're quite generous, but they're also discounted, which I'll just show you in a minute. So a ton saved in China is not the same as a ton saved in the US. There's penalties, basically fines, and the fines are roughly 2x the price of whatever the price of carbon is, and so that's a reasonably credible threat, if you like. Banking will be allowed, and it will be able to be linked to some of the some of the other schemes, particularly the European scheme. The profile of emissions reductions is a little bit funky. The reason it goes up at the beginning there is that it's adding in sectors of industry as you go, so that it's kind of going down, and then they add in the petrochemicals industry, and it goes down a bit more, and they add in aviation or whatever it is. Let's skip that one. This is the offsets. So the total tons of offsets allowed a decline each year a little bit. As a proportion of the total cap, though, they actually increase. And then, as I say, there's actually basically a 20% discount. So an offset is worth 0.8 tons of emissions abatement. And then, if you just do a little fun bit of math, the dark blue is the emissions credits issued. The lighter blue in the middle there, that big wedge, that is roughly abatement potential taken from the US curve I showed you earlier, just simply straight lined between now and 2030, which is a hugely simplifying assumption and probably quite wrong in some ways. And then on top of that, you have the emissions, the potential for offsets, both international and domestic. And then that line with the solid line with the dots on it, that's the BAU emissions line. And so the rough math is, should just about work, but it's pretty aggressive because to get that whole curve is a big challenge. And as I said before, not all of that curve is particularly incented by a cap and trade scheme. Changing our light bulbs, which is a big, significant piece. A cap and trade scheme will not make a great deal of difference to that. So just finally, if you're in a sort of non-regulated sector, how could you play? An example here is this is based on the California dairy industry. So as you know, and I've worked with the dairymen a bit, and the thing I always like about this story is that when you're talking about manure and cows, even they can't keep a straight face, right? So it's an interesting topic to find yourself doing. Anyway, roughly, here's how it works, right? A dairy farm emits a lot of methane, right? And roughly speaking, 1,000 cows emit about 21,000 cubic feet of methane per day, so 21 cubic feet each per cow per day, which equates to, given the global warming potential of methane, equates to about 9 tons of methane. And that's, of carbon dioxide equivalent. And that's going up into the atmosphere and contributing to global warming. And there are various bits of legislation, Dan referred to one earlier, of knocking around that would try and actually cause the dairy industry to buy credits for those emissions. The alternative is that you capture the manure in various ways and you put it into a digester pond, which is, there's lots of different ways of doing it, but one of them is a digester pond. It's basically a big lagoon with a big black balloon on top of it, right? And the microbes do their thing, and the methane is made, and you capture it. And rather than it getting away into the atmosphere, you capture it. On the upper branch there, the simplest thing you can do with it is just flare the methane, just burn it. And even though you haven't done anything else, you've got no energy use out of it at all. You've just sent it up the flare. Because you've burned it, and so you've turned it into carbon dioxide and water, your emissions have dropped from 9.3 tons to about 2.25 tons. So there's a big saving in carbon dioxide just to burn it. If the price of carbon was high enough and you could monetize that, it might be worth doing just that, right? The other thing, that obviously feels a little wasteful, right? So the other thing you can do with it is before you burn it, burn it for a purpose, if you like. You need to purify it quite significantly in order to do that, and that's a not insignificant cost. But you can feed it to a generator, and that gas would generate about 2,900 kilowatt hours, right? Would still emit 2.25 tons of carbon dioxide. Or I can just burn it as gas, and I'd still get 2.25 tons of carbon dioxide, but I would get paid for the calories, if you like, in the gas. Interestingly, you actually get more gas from the digester than you do from just sort of letting it lie around on the ground, if you like, because the digester is obviously optimized to increase the yield, right? So the worst possible thing you can do is to have a digester and then not burn it. And believe it or not, that situation has happened in California due to air quality standards, and you can't. So on occasion, they have been unable to get a permit for the flare, and they kind of go, well, okay, I'll just vent it, and that's about as bad as you can possibly think of. And I'm glad to say we seem to have solved that problem. You can't possibly read this, so I'll skip over it. But the point is, if you can sell the gas or the electricity and get a carbon credit, it looks to us like you're in the money. If all you do is sell the electricity, it's a long putt to make the economics work, right? But if you can get, say $30 a ton, and that's a number, frankly, I pulled out of my ear, right? If you can get $30 a ton for the carbon credit, then these kinds of projects can be in the money, and then there's lots of detail to be worked through about how you do that and the different technologies that are available. But if the dairy industry could participate, then they can capture that $30 a ton, say, for the offset, and the project kind of gets its head above water and is worth doing. So that's just a simple example of how an offset project might work in an industry that I think is reasonably relevant around here. In closing, I think just to go back to the curve, what I would ask us, or what I'd ask you to do, is just don't forget about the left-hand side. There's a lot of really, really cool stuff on the right. All the really interesting stuff, and I admit it, it's really good fun, right? There's a lot of kind of blocking and tackling on the left-hand side, and there's a lot that policymakers can do about that in terms of how you work with the public utilities commissions, how you do, what we have in California, decoupling of power and that kind of stuff, to incent activity on the left-hand side and capture that efficiency prize. Thank you.